being here for this. And also a special thanks to Howie Fairstein for helping to arrange this. So as Josh mentioned, I'll be talking about the Amazon, the amazing Amazonia, which is a really well-studied region in terms of its biology. It's loaded with biodiversity, as Josh mentioned. And I want to start by talking about something that I'm sure many of you are pretty familiar with. So about a year and a half ago, I think everyone's social media feeds, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, were filled with images like this, right? Oops, there we go. So we had headlines exclaiming that the Amazon was burning. At the time, in 2019, Brazil's National Institute for Space Research estimated that forest fires in Amazonia had increased by about 80% from the previous year. So this is something that was really, really bad in 2019, but it's something that's also been going on for a very long time, and it has continued in 2020. So here's just some data that were compiled by Mangabe, showing you deforested land through time. And you can see down at the bottom, 2019 and 2020 really stand out as big years for Amazonian deforestation. And so by November of last year, the equivalent of about 1.5 million football fields had been cut down in Amazonia. So really a huge amount of loss for this biome. And at the time, celebrities were getting involved. We had this hashtag Pray for Amazonia, which is really great to get some attention on this problem. Here's a celebrity getting involved, Lil Nas X. Where does the donation go to help stop the fire in the Amazon? And while this was happening, I couldn't help but realize that I think a lot of people have a pretty superficial understanding about what Amazonia is. And so I want to kind of start with the basics and just talk about where exactly is Amazonia. This may be simple for many of you, but just to get everybody on the same page. So it's in South America, of course. And if we zoom in, we can see this yellow area on this large map is the Amazon basin. So all the rain that falls within this yellow region ultimately flows through the Amazon River and out into the Atlantic Ocean. And it's not exactly the same as the distribution of Amazonian rainforest, but it's a pretty good approximation for where that rainforest is. So it's so big, it actually covers 9 different countries, the equivalent of about 2 million square miles. So most of it is in Brazil, but of course there's big chunks in Bolivia and in Peru and a bunch of other countries. And that 2 million square miles is 50% larger. Let's see, there we go, 50% larger than the country of India. So it's really a huge amount of real estate. And because it's so big, in part because it's so big, it's extremely biodiverse, right? So I think people often have this kind of idea about the Amazon jungle or maybe rainforests in general, right? They're pristine forests, they're packed with wildlife, birds, and so on. I just find this image really funny because it's just so crazy. My wife calls this the Lisa Frank version of the Amazon. But of course, the reality is that lots of the species you see in this don't occur anywhere near South America. So there's no birds of paradise, right? Those are 10,000 miles away. That's my dog. Don't mind him. There's no elephants. There's actually no crocodiles. There are caimans, which are a type of alligator. And there are, in terms of primates, there's no great apes, there's no lemurs, but there is a huge amount of primate diversity. So these cute little things like marmosets and tamarins, these really bizarre looking monkeys called saki monkeys, these cute little things with bushy tails, TT monkeys, these night monkeys, things like howler monkeys, and several other different types of monkeys, including things you may know like spider monkeys. So beyond birds, Amazonia is super rich. And this is what the inside of the Amazon rainforest actually looks like. So it's really dark, it's really, really green, it's densely packed with lianas and understory vegetation. It's so dense that you don't really see that much. There's actually a person in this photo that you probably didn't notice. So really, really densely packed with vegetation. And beyond just being densely packed packed with vegetation. It's really biodiverse, right? So this map is showing you the number of species of birds, amphibians, and mammals across the globe. And you can see that Amazonia, right, that dark red area of South America really stands out compared to the rest of the world. So it contains about 18% of the world's tree species. It contains 10 to 15% of all bird species, and as much as 40% of the world's butterfly species may occur in Amazonia. So lots and lots and lots of biodiversity. And it's also a globally important biome. So it contains 13% of all trees. So I'm not talking about species of tree now, I mean individual trees. So 13% of all the trees on Earth occur in the Amazon rainforest. And that means it's really important to us, right? So it supplies about 20% of the Earth's oxygen. This helps mitigate climate change by sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. And of course, when you deforest, when you burn it down, it becomes a major source of carbon into the atmosphere, which then contributes to climate change. So it's hugely important to us in addition to biodiversity. And then it sits in the middle of a region of the world that is in general very biodiverse. So you can see the areas surrounding the Amazon are also coming up as dark red, dark yellow, and this is what the area we refer to as the Neotropics. This is the tropical region of Central and South America. So there's a lot of biodiversity, and many of you who, you're all bird watchers, and many of you may have traveled to South America or Central America, and you're familiar with some of the diversity there. Things like harpy eagles and tanagers in every color you can imagine. The wood creepers and antbirds, which are ubiquitous down there. Everybody loves these royal flycatchers, and all the world's hummingbirds occur in the Americas. And so it's just a really, really cool place. Beyond birds, of course, there's something for everyone. And so the question that's on a lot of biologists' minds is, why are there so many species in Amazonia? And one way of thinking about this is asking why are there so many species compared to other regions, right? I'm currently in the Catskills. My yard list is about 70 species here. And the whole Catskills region, which is a pretty sizable chunk of New York, only has about 120 breeding species in this whole region. But if you go to Manaus, which is a city that has about 2 million people in it in the middle of the Amazon, you actually have more like 400 species or more down there. So this is a huge discrepancy between these two regions. And so why is that? So biologists in general know that there are only three basic parameters, three factors that control the number of species in any given place on Earth. So there's dispersal, which is colonization, right? So many of you may be familiar with the fact that cattle egrets, about 150 years ago, a big flock of cattle egrets flew across the Atlantic Ocean, colonized South America, and now we have cattle egrets all over the Americas. And so this is a great example of colonization. There's also speciation, which is the generation of new species. This is new species that are evolving in place. And then there's extinction, which of course is removing species from the landscape. So these three things determine how many species there are. And so any explanation for why the Amazon is so species rich, has to consider these three things. And biologists are kind of divided into two main schools of thought here. So one view is that the Amazon has all these species because it's a cradle of biodiversity. So Amazonia is a place that's special in that it generates a lot of new biodiversity over time through very high rates of speciation. So a cradle is a place that fosters the generation of new biodiversity. And the other view is that Amazonia is a museum of biodiversity. So Amazonia may have a lot of species because it has relatively low extinction compared to other regions. So over very long periods of time, it's accumulated a large number of species that have persisted in these environments. And another part of this museum hypothesis is also that maybe some of the species that occur there actually evolved somewhere else and then colonized this area. So it's not like a cradle, it's not generating its own diversity. And so for this museum hypothesis, there's actually really good evidence out there that this is what's going on. So Amazonia is this really ancient ecosystem that was once a lot more extensive than it currently is, right? So tropical forests were once extended over much of Earth's surface, right, into much higher latitudes, including North America and Southern South America. And we actually know from the fossil record that many modern types of Amazonian plants were already established in South America by about 50 million years ago. And so if you were to walk into South America 25, 30 million years ago, you would probably see a rainforest that's not all that different than what we see there today. And so this suggests that there's been a lot of time to accumulate biodiversity, like this museum hypothesis suggests. And there's really cutting edge research that continues to go into this and support this idea. Here is a study that came out just a couple months ago that supports the museum hypothesis. This study focuses on subausine songbirds, which these are your antbirds, your flycatchers, wood creepers, and lots of other things. It's the most common group of birds in South America and Central America. And so what you're looking at on this map here is the number of subausine species across Earth. And you can see, as we expect, Amazonia lights up as dark red. So it has a lot of subausine biodiversity. But then sort of paradoxically, what these researchers found in this study was that the speciation rate is actually slower where there is more diversity. So here you're seeing in this bottom map that these yellows are showing you slower speciation rates, which is kind of odd. If you have more species, you would expect maybe higher speciation rates, but that's not the case. And then they also looked at the age of species across space. So how long ago these species evolved. And what they find is that North America has younger species than South America. And so this is suggesting that low extinction might be the reason why there are more species in Amazonia, which is consistent with that museum hypothesis. And this makes sense if you know a bit about Earth history. So over the past several million years, few million years, there have been these repeated glaciations. These cause major changes to the northern latitudes, causing repeated extinctions and potentially allowing for more rapid speciation to occur. But that probably isn't the entire story. That may explain a big chunk of species, but it probably doesn't explain everything, right? There has been a lot of extinction. There are no longer ground sloths, and there are no longer these giant caimans that used to eat those ground sloths. This one, I think, was about 15 meters in length. So there has definitely been extinction occurring. And so this brings me to some of my research, which really focuses on understanding and testing some of the aspects of the cradle hypothesis. So let's revisit this question. Why does Amazonia have so many species? So I want to dive into a study I published 2 years ago in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, where we looked at the evolutionary history of one of my favorite groups of birds. This is the tityrines. These include things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Things like tityras, these black and white cavity nesting birds that are really abundant in Central and South America. Also Bacards. This is a rose-throated Bacard, which gets into like the Rio Grande Valley of Southern Texas into Southeast Arizona. But Bacards also includes other species like this barred Bacard. There's actually a pretty high diversity within the Bacards. And then one some of you may not be as familiar with is these purple tufts, which there are a few species in South America. These are tiny little birds with these beautiful purple tufts on their underwing. that these things are tiny and they kind of just inhabit the treetops, the way tops of the canopies, and are really difficult to see, but they're really cool. And so basically what you need to know about this study is I used a lot of genetic data. I basically got thousands of molecular data points for each one of these species. Spent a lot of time at my computer, very frustrated with computational work that wasn't working. And ultimately, I did this in order to estimate the evolutionary relationships among the tityrines. And so this diagram is just showing those relationships among this group. So basically, this is called a phylogeny, and it just depicts how the group evolved over time in a branching pattern. And so I implemented kind of a statistical model. This was used in order to understand the history of speciation and colonization in these birds. And here you're looking at 6 different areas that we looked at here that these birds inhabit. Each has a different color on the map, and Amazonia is that dark green blob in the center. And I don't want to go into the details really of this figure because, as you can see, it's kind of messy for a talk like this. But the main takeaway from this figure is that the boxes shown on the phylogenetic tree represent the inferred ancestral area at the time of speciation. And you can see that those dark green boxes are all at the base of the tree, which shows that this group originated in Amazonia. It began in Amazonia, and then had lots of new species forming within Amazonia for much of its history. And I can kind of simplify that and summarize that for you with a kind of a simple chart here. So here, this bar is showing you the number of speciation events within each region, what we call in situ speciation. And you can see this dark green bar at the top stands out as Amazonia has much higher speciation than the rest of the groups. Excuse me, the rest of the areas. There we go. And so next we can look at colonization coming out of a given area. So this is emigration. And again, we can see that Amazonia is responsible for most of the emigration in the history of this group. And then finally, we can look at colonization of each area. So immigration into each one of these 6 areas. And in this case, the dark green bar of Amazonia is really small. And so it's not receiving much of this tityrine diversity from other areas. And so the Amazon seems to be generating a lot of young biodiversity in this group, even though it's this really old biome. And this is consistent with that Amazonia as a cradle of biodiversity hypothesis. And so another way of thinking about this question is of why there are so many species in Amazonia is to ask what exactly is causing new species to form in Amazonia, processes that might not be going on somewhere else. And so to understand the rest of my research, I want to give you a little bit of background. So biologists know that what we're going to call barriers to dispersal isolate populations and prevent interbreeding between these populations. So some of you might be asking, some of you with a biology background are probably familiar with this, but those without might be asking, well, what the heck is a barrier to dispersal? And so here's a map showing you the distributions of several species of toucanet. These are toucans in the genus Selenodera. They're these cute little toucans that fly around in the rainforest. They're really, really cool. You can see that each of these colors on the map is showing you the distribution of a different species. And you can see that the distributions are pretty much not overlapping at all, right? And so the basic idea is that these species are each separated by barriers. And so a barrier can come in many shapes and sizes, but we can define it generally as any geographic feature that represents an impediment to the movement of organisms. So anything that in this case birds, but anything that organisms can't easily cross. And so it turns out that when populations of the same species get separated by a barrier, it could be a river, it could be a mountain range, it could be, again, anything that they can't easily get across. That separation is what begins the process of speciation. So that's how new species begin to form. This is somewhat of an oversimplification to people with a biology background, but I think it gets the main point across is that these barriers start the process in most cases of speciation. And that's what's going on in these toucans. And so, for example, the Andes Mountains are a really important barrier. In this case, they're separating Amazonian rainforest from rainforests in northwestern South America and Central America. And so they're a really good barrier for these toucans. There's also habitat barriers. So here, the arid corridor, this area of lots of savanna and seasonally dry forest separates the Amazonian rainforests from the Atlantic rainforests. And also in Amazonia, rivers turn out to be really important for a lot of different birds. So here I'm showing you the Madeira River, which is one of the largest rivers in the Amazon. It flows right into the Amazon River. And it's separating this Solenodera gouldi from Solenodera reinwartii, these two species of toucanet. And in fact, ornithologists know that these rivers are very important because there are repeated patterns of distribution. We call these areas of endemism, where lots and lots of different species of birds have really similar distributions that in many cases are delineated by these large rivers. And this is similar to the case in toucanets, but lots and lots and lots of birds show this. So things like trumpeters and trogons and jacamars and lots of different types of toucans and wood creepers, manakins, these things that if you go to the Neotropics, if you go into the Amazon, these are some of your most common species, some of the things you really see a lot of. And this isn't necessarily surprising to people who know that the Amazon is really packed with rivers. If you look at this topographic map, this really fine resolution topographic map, you can see how pervasive these rivers are in the landscape, and really how gigantic they can be, how wide they can be, and so on. And between two of these rivers that are known to be barriers for lots of different birds, the Madeira River and the Tapajós River, there's actually some interesting stuff going on that evolutionary biologists are only just kind of discovering very recently. So between these rivers, we're seeing really fine scale patterns of what you might call cryptic species. So species that don't really look all that different, but turn out to be genetically very different, different enough to make us think that they might be different species. So this is a study from a colleague of mine, Mateus Ferreira, looking at genetic diversity within the rufous-necked puffbird. And all of these colors on the map are showing you that within this species, he found lots of genetically different groups of birds, many more than we ever thought existed before. And it seems that it's not just the case with this puffbird, but lots and lots of different types of animals, lots of birds, but also some monkeys and even some butterflies show these really fine scale patterns within this region. And we're still learning a lot. Just 2 years ago, a new species of marmoset was discovered from this region. So even just basic natural history stuff, we're still learning in this area. And so this is clearly a really interesting place to study the question of whether Amazonia is a cradle of biodiversity, because a lot of very young biodiversity is forming here. And so I wanted to study this area in more detail, but I found that museum collections actually really don't have much information about this region. We don't have a lot of study specimens and things like that. We don't have much genetic material to work with. We really don't know what's going on there. So in 2018, I organized some field work with colleagues at the Louisiana State University, as well as the Gilder Museum of Natural History, which is in Belém, Brazil. These are folks that have a lot of field experience. I collaborated with some really great field biologists here. And of course, it would not have been possible without the extensive knowledge of our local guides as well. And so behind us here is the Arapuaná River, very close to its confluence with the Roosevelt River. And you can see it's really not a very large river. It doesn't seem like it's that far across. And so you may not think it can be important for limiting the movement of birds. And this river system is really famous for this grueling 1914 expedition that was, it was in part organized by my current institution, the American Museum of Natural History, where you had Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon and Teddy Roosevelt set out to map what they called at the time the River of Doubt, the Rio Duida, and this was really an uncharted region at the time. And you can see from these photos the toll this trip took on Teddy. So over on the left, you know, he's looking like he's doing pretty well. He's eating well. He's pretty big. And then by the end of the trip, you know, he had really bad malaria, multiple bouts of it. They were running out of supplies, running out of food, really barely scraping by. And you can see how much weight he lost. He's swimming in his trousers there. And although in the US, Teddy gets most of the credit for this trip, it really wasn't possible without Rondon, who I think is also this really fascinating character. He saved Teddy's life several times on this trip. He was primarily of indigenous descent, and he came from extreme poverty. And yet he ended up being one of the most important Brazilian figures of his time. So he was a really important scientist. He was a really important ethnologist, and so much more. He contributed more specimens to the Brazilian National Museum than any other person ever, including to this day. And so I'd love to talk about this trip for a long time. There's a couple books, if you're interested, you can look into, and I would encourage you to learn more about them. But we didn't have such a hard time. We ate very well. Things like Brazil nuts foraged, you know, from the forest floor, fresh fish almost every day, lots of delicious food. We had really nice setups in terms of our campsites. You know, we had multiple campsites set up throughout this about 6 weeks that we spent there. And it was, you know, really wasn't that bad. Like I said, most of the time, it could be a bit scary from time to time. So one night I was sleeping in my hammock, which was right there. And I really couldn't sleep all night. I kept hearing an animal outside rustling around. I could hear it breathing, snorting, and kept kind of peeking outside of my hammock. Didn't see anything. When I got up the next morning, I found out that the rest of the camp had a very similar experience. Nobody slept well, and everybody heard this animal. And after breakfast, somebody stumbled across this footprint in the middle of our camp, which was this is of course a jaguar. So we had a jaguar walking through our camp in the middle of the night, which was a little freaky, but really we were pretty safe, and it was a lot of fun. And most importantly, 99% of the time we're doing this, we were catching birds to get genetic materials. We were collecting specimens that scientists will be able to use for many centuries to come, long after any rainforest is gone from this region. And we get a lot of data about all these birds we catch, in addition to the genetic materials. So the vast majority of Amazonian birds, we really don't know that much about their basic natural history. We don't know about their distribution. We don't know about their abundance or their diet, and lots of other things that we can learn from collecting specimens. And remember, this forest in this area is actually going, and so it's urgent to try to learn this stuff now. And we actually did discover some really interesting stuff. So here you're looking at two subspecies of the gray ant wren. One has a black throat and one has a gray throat. And these two subspecies have been really well known for a very long time, but what wasn't known until this trip was that they are actually changing over at the Roosevelt River. So this really small river, on the left bank, you have a black-throated subspecies, and on the right bank, you have this gray-throated species. So that was pretty interesting. Something's clearly going on there. And so I want to bring us back to this question, because this is the main reason we went on this trip. We collected these samples. And I'm going to show you some work from a study that isn't published yet. So this is brand new. this is all based on, again, data from that expedition, but not that many people have seen this yet. So it's pretty new. I think there's some pretty cool results. And we're going to see if there's evidence for a cradle or for a museum and try to understand what is going on in the Amazon. So again, I focus on genetic material or genetics for much of my research. We collected a ton of genetic material. In this case, we get hundreds of thousands of data points for each bird species. Spent a lot of time on my computer again, a lot of time getting frustrated, and then we get results. I don't want to bore you guys by going into the details of all the methods we used, but the main takeaway is that we use this machine learning algorithm that's called TSNE. It's kind of a stupid word, but that's what it's called. And basically what it's doing is it's doing lots and lots of really, really complicated mathematical calculations, and it's then categorizing birds by how similar they are to each other based on their genetics. And you can see that the points on this figure each represent an individual bird. They're colored based on where on the map those birds came from. So you can see the purples and reds. That's showing you where they came from. And the idea is that the more closely together they cluster on this plot, the more similar they are genetically, and the farther apart they are, the more different they are genetically. And you can see a pattern that kind of probably jumps out at you, which is that things that are close together on the map or from the same area on the map go together in terms of their genetics. And what we find is that there's lots of genetically different groups within this one species, the rufous-necked puffbird. And so what's really interesting about this one species is that within the same region, this yellow area here that's between the Jiparaná and Arapuaná rivers, we see these two yellow clusters on the plot. This is telling us that there are actually two different populations of this bird that are occupying the same exact space, same habitat, even the same exact locations in some cases, and yet they're not interbreeding with each other. They've developed genetic differences. And we can look at one of these phylogenies and ask how closely related they are to each other compared to the rest of the populations. And we can see that these two yellow clusters are actually not closely related to each other. And so based on this evidence, pretty much any biologist would agree that we have a new unnamed and cryptic species here because there's no differences in plumage, for example. And the story is very similar for the other 5 species, but given our limited time, I won't go into the details of each one. But lots of genetically different populations within each of these 6 species groups. And then we can actually test with statistics what's causing these genetic differences. So it looks generally like it's rivers, large rivers and small rivers, but we can compare the effects of, say, the environment or the distance, just the geographic distance from each other. We can compare those to rivers. And the main takeaway from this figure is just that rivers seem to explain almost all of the genetic differences within this bird, which is the blue-cheeked jacamar, but the same is true for the other 5. And so we've known for a very long time that large rivers are very important for birds, as I mentioned earlier. But it turns out that we're seeing that even these small rivers, like the Rio Roosevelt, seem to be having an effect in terms of speciation in Amazonian birds too. So I think that's some pretty good evidence for a cradle hypothesis. But I want to show you a little bit more about some of these birds. So typically or traditionally, evolutionary biologists have thought about speciation that looks something like this phylogeny in the middle, where species branch apart in a tree-like structure to form new species. But one thing we're learning from lots and lots of genetic data is that in these birds, they're not only branching apart, but they're also coming back together. And so these red and white lines are showing exactly that. that they're branching apart and in many cases coming back together. So that's genetically different groups that are coming back together. And so what we think is going on is that since these rivers seem to be very important, the rivers are moving around quite a bit. So this is a geological study. The arrows here are just showing you where some of these rivers used to flow. So this can be anywhere from 50,000 years ago to about 250,000 years ago. These rivers moved around quite a bit over that period of time that, in terms of evolutionary biology, is a pretty short period of time. And the interesting thing is that it seems like a lot of this cryptic bird diversity that we've been discovering is also only a few 100,000 years old. So we think that these rivers moving around is having a major effect on speciation. So I think we've partially answered the question of, is Amazonia an evolutionary cradle or museum? And I think the answer is that it's clearly both. We know that Amazonia has this really old history and that it's experienced less extinction probably than North America, at least relatively recently over the last few million years. But also a lot of the diversity in Amazonia has probably been overlooked. There's a lot of really good evidence, if you're willing to look for it, that Amazonia is also generating species really all the time. So this is the region that I was just talking about. This is where lots and lots of these cryptic species seem to be occurring, species that we really didn't have any knowledge of until the last decade or so. And this is very concerning to me because this is also the region that is being deforested at the fastest rate. So here's a map that's 6 years old already, and you can see that these red areas is where there has been deforestation by the year 2015. So a huge amount of forest already lost 6 years ago. And we know it's gotten a lot worse since then, and we know it's going to continue to get worse. So here's a map that shows predictions for the year 2050. Yellow on this map is showing you deforested land. The red is showing you fragmented forest, and we know fragmented forest can be very bad for biodiversity. And the blue is showing you the remaining continuous Amazon forest. And so based on current deforestation rates, what this study predicts is that only about 60% of Amazonian forest will remain by 2050. So in fewer than 30 years, only 60% will remain. If you account for the effects of future climate change, the number drops down to about 50% remaining. So a huge amount of forest will be lost. And most of this is in this region that we know has much more biodiversity than we previously thought. And so, I think the social media attention is really, really great, but I also think we can do more than just pray for Amazonia. One thing that I tell people is that you can advocate for Indigenous rights and support organizations that advocate for Indigenous communities. So in Amazonia, Indigenous people are still under threat of things like illegal land seizures. People continue to be enslaved and even murdered by ranchers. It's probably rare, but it does continue to occur. There's illegal mining and illegal miners that do all kinds of bad things. And these indigenous lands, which you can see on this map in yellow, actually account for a big chunk of protected lands in Amazonia right now. And so supporting indigenous communities is really a good thing for Amazonia. But also most of the deforestation in Amazonia is directly related to cattle ranching. So Brazil is actually the largest beef exporter in the world. So, US corporations are buying up some of this meat, and fast food chains are buying up some of this meat, as are lots and lots of other countries. And beef is probably the most important driver of deforestation in this region, but there's also another big one, which is soy. And soy is also primarily used just for animal feed. So much of the world has made soy their primary animal feed because it's really nutritious. It's loaded with fat and protein, and it's also really, really easy to grow. And interestingly, and kind of sadly, thanks to Trump's trade war with China, China has increased their imports of Brazilian soy by about 100% in 2020 since 2019, and they've almost halved their U.S. imports. So they're getting a lot more soy from Brazil and a lot less from the U.S. And this increase in Brazilian soy is expected to also increase the total amount of soy grown in Amazonia to a total of about 30 million acres. So that's 30 million acres just going to soy. That's an area the size of the country of Greece, just covered in soy in the middle of the Amazon. So these are obviously huge problems, things to think about. And I am sorry to end on kind of a sad note, but I hope that overall I've convinced you that Amazonia really is an amazing place. That even though the reasons for its high biodiversity are sometimes debated by scientists, it's this ancient biome that's had a long time to accumulate this immense species richness, but it's also a cradle of biodiversity in South America that pumps out new species of birds thanks in part to its river system. And finally, it's a place of global importance. It's really is a place that's very important to humans, and it deserves our attention. And so thank you all for listening. I put a couple organizations here that I do like. I encourage you to do your own research, but these are a few organizations that protect rainforests in South America. They're not all tied to the Amazon, but they're all good, really good. So thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Right. We have a bit of an ovation for you there. Yeah, it's one of the negatives of Zoom is that you don't get the big ovation from the crowd.
Oh, that's all right.
But you have to imagine
Appreciate that
ovation that you've got.
Yeah.
At an in-person talk. Anyway, we have a number of questions piled up in the chat window, so I'll read off questions and field your answers as we go.
Okay.
Let's see. So, and several of the questions are kind of related to each other.
Okay.
One being, we have some large rivers in the United States, like the Mississippi, and we don't see nearly as much speciation going on from one side of the Mississippi to the other as seems to be happening in the Amazon. So what's different up here versus down there?
That is a really, really good question. So yes, we do have big rivers. They in North America. They actually do affect probably not birds, although there's some subspecies that roughly turn over. Things like red-bellied woodpecker. You could think about the subspecies turning over there, although it's not as neat as it is in Amazonia. So Amazonia is really unique in this way. So there's no other place in the world where organisms consistently change. You have new species changing over across these rivers. The Congo River in Africa has a few species. There's some evidence that this river can affect speciation in birds, but the Amazon is unique because it's really much, much bigger than all these other river systems. So I think it's something like it pumps out more water than the next 7 largest basins combined. So it's a huge, huge amount of water coming out of this river system, and it's a really flat landscape. And these rivers can get really, really big. And the other thing is that tropical birds are actually really bad at dispersing. They're really bad in many cases at moving around. So when you think of a tropical rainforest in the Americas, many of you probably think of these army ant swarms, where you have these big swarms of army ants devouring everything in their path, and you have this amazing flock of birds moving around with these ants. These birds are tied to the forest floor in many cases. They do not like light areas in many cases. They do not like flying out into gaps in the forest. They often don't even cross roads if they can avoid it. And so they are really averse to crossing rivers, which can be in many cases many kilometers across. And so they behaviorally are tied to the forest, and things like toucans as well are actually really bad flyers. And they don't like to cross big expanses either if they can avoid it. So part of it is behavioral, and part of it is also the unique basin itself.
Okay, and that actually addresses one of the other questions that had come up about someone had asked why birds don't just fly across the rivers and maintain gene flow and prevent speciation that way.
Yeah.
But let's see. So there's also a question about barriers formed by humans and how much they contribute to speciation. And I know in South Texas with the construction of the border wall, there's concern, there's much debate over to what extent that'll affect birds and butterflies and such. So whether the species that range north into Texas have enough in common with the Amazonian species to be affected by that kind of thing. And as the Amazon gets increasingly fragmented by deforestation, could that accelerate speciation down there? So
yes, that is a very good question. So I think definitely it's going to affect ultimately the number of species for a number of different reasons. So any fragmentation, so building roads, and like I mentioned, birds often don't even like to cross roads. All that stuff is going to reduce connectivity between populations that are already kind of small. And that increases the likelihood that any one of those small populations might go extinct due to kind of random factors. So that's why fragmentation might be bad. It probably will not affect speciation unless we're talking about really, really long-term barriers. So things that are going to be around for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, which they could be, but it's unclear. The short-term problems associated with these things are really what I think are most concerning, and I don't think they're likely to cause, say, new species forming.
So more extinction than speciation.
More extinction, yeah. We're going to have as you all know, we're going to have a major loss of biodiversity in the coming decades.
Okay. Let's see. Another question asks about the definition of a cryptic species and how it relates to vocalizations, that if two species are identical in plumage but can be differentiated vocally by sound, are those still cryptic species or not?
That's a good question. I would say any time when you have what we currently consider a single species, this is always going to be because of a lack of information, right? So we may find out that they're genetically different, or we may find out that their songs are very different. And as you all know, birdsong is very important for determining species limits in birds. Yes, I would still say they're cryptic, because anytime you can't distinguish them just from, say, going to a museum and looking at specimens, anytime where taxonomists have kind of gotten it wrong, that's a cryptic species. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot we just don't know, especially when we're talking about a place like the Amazon, where in many cases we just have a handful of specimens that have been used to understand those species. And we don't have any information about their song, or we have very limited information about their song. It's growing thanks to like Xenocanto and eBird and the Macaulay Library. We're learning a lot about birdsong, but for the vast majority of these birds, we had very limited understanding.
Okay, and that bled into another question that was asked more recently by Don Kreutzma. I imagine you know him from his research into birdsong. He asked if anyone had a tape recorder on your expedition to
Yes, we were all recording.
and to what degree you saw correlation between genetic differences and song differences in the cryptic species you found.
So I for my research, I haven't looked into song differences at all. I've done some exploration and qualitative stuff, but I haven't actually quantified any of it. However, we did collect birdsong. We all had tape recorders on us at all times. I mean, MP3 digital recorders at all times. And we're recording microphones whenever we're out and we hear something. We try to record. And a lot of recent discoveries of species, I should have said this before, but a lot of recent discoveries of new species in this area are based on birdsong more than, say, genetics or more than, say, plumage. So the increase in birdsong is really useful. But we try to get it when we can.
Excellent. Let's see. There's one more question back here, which you kind of touched on briefly, but I bet you could go on in much more detail on this. That question about as genetic science is advancing, is it why is it necessary to still collect specimens to kill animals and preserve them in museums, as opposed to just sampling them alive and in the wild?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a very good question. It's a question I get a lot. And specimens have, of course, they've been important to the natural sciences for a very, very long time. Specimens that are in museums today that were collected hundreds of years ago are being used in ways that nobody ever could have imagined that they're used for. Like you said, we have advances in genetics and genomics that allow us to use these specimens in novel ways. I like to think of specimen collections, new specimen collections, as snapshots in time. So we've used specimens, for example, for conservation purposes. So we know, thanks to museum specimens, that DDT nearly caused the extinction of multiple species of birds of prey in North America. We know, thanks to specimens, about things like population changes and what you might call microevolution. So short-term changes in genetics or short-term changes in plumage associated with, say, climate change or with pollution and things like this. So these collections are extremely, extremely useful to a huge range of biologists. They continue to be useful. And for example, at the Museum of Natural History in New York, we have visitors all the time that come in and they measure specimens and they look at the plumage and they take genetic samples. And we're getting a huge amount of additional data now too. So we get information about what they're eating when we open their stomachs. We get information about what their condition is, and all of this gets recorded. So it's really useful. And we're also extremely cautious with how we take these specimens. So, we have very, very strict permitting that we go through, right? So it's not as though anyone can go in there and just kill as many birds as they want. We generally take such a small number of individual birds of a species that it's nowhere near what can possibly affect, say, their populations. It's nowhere near something that's going to be a conservation concern. But quite, as I mentioned, it's really the opposite of that. We're really making strides in terms of understanding conservation problems and things like that. And so I think that would be my main argument, was just that there's so many uses for these specimens. We can't even imagine what they're going to be used for in 100 years. And yet they're there in a museum for decades or centuries to come.
All right, great. So it's been several minutes since any more questions have come in. So maybe this next one will be the last one, but
okay.
But one more question at least. What does caiman taste like?
Well, it tastes like chicken.
That was predictable, wasn't it? So
Yeah, it really does. It tastes like chicken. It's a little flaky like fish, but if you've eaten alligator in like Florida or something, it tastes like alligator. You know, it's kind of a chicken that has a slightly fishy texture.
okay, and that question inspired a follow-up. What about tapir? How does that taste?
Oh God, I never want to think about eating tapir again. We spent a night in oh my God, we spent a night in a village, a really small village, right on the Arapuana River. That's where that picture was taken of the whole crew that you saw. And the first night, we stayed in the home of a family, and we just kind of ate whatever they gave us. And I kind of asked what we were eating because it tasted a little funky. And one of the things was tapir, and I had never been so sick in my life. The tapir was a week or more old. They were drying it, but it's the rainforest, right? So the drying doesn't work so well, and so I didn't have my gringo guts couldn't handle it really. So it tastes. I don't remember. I don't want to remember. Let's put it that way.
How do you acquire your caiman for eating?
That's a good question. So we had local guides with us. These are folks that live in the local communities, and they it's totally legal for them to just basically collect bushmeat, and they would just come back with it and share it with us, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Many years ago, when I was a teenager, my family went to Alaska and visited the Pribilof Islands, and my brother tried seal meat while we were out there, and I think his reaction to seal was kind of similar to yours to tapir.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lucas.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for having me.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for coming to Lucas's talk, everybody, and we will see you when Dan Clem comes to town or comes to Zoom next month. So, and I know, Lucas, if you look at the Zoom, the little chat window on the side is quite a number of people sending compliments about how much they like.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.